Good morning, City Church. It is such a joy to be with you all this morning on Pride Sunday. I just still can't believe that I am a super lesbian, little like underground priest preaching at an actual church on a Sunday morning. There were decades when I didn't think that day could ever come. And I just want to acknowledge that because Christianity and because the church was a part of so much of the suffering, of causing so much of the suffering that the queer communities experienced throughout our whole history, the profound power that you all have, that we all have as the church to bring about healing. And so days like this, moments like that, like this, or when we see that really happening. And I just want to give like my heartfelt thanks to those of you in leadership and all the queer people in the community who are bravely showing up and continuing to enter into a space that told you for so long you weren't wanted. And I just want to say that you are a role model by showing up for people who haven't yet felt that freedom and found that sense of courage and confidence, or maybe the community to be able to do that themselves, but feel a little more hopeful about their own futures just by seeing you there. So thank you to all my people and all my family for continuing to just show up and put your bodies out there when you've experienced so much trauma and doing so in the past. I know it comes at a cost, and I'm so thankful for you. So, in the last few years, we've seen injustices that have been at work for hundreds of years come to the forefront of our public conversations. People have become aware of the suffering of queer people throughout our history, of the violence white people have inflicted against Black folks. We've heard more about the rampant sexual assault women experienced over the decades. We heard more about that through the Me Too movement. And as those injustices with a very long history have come to the forefront of our conversations, many people, many of us, are earnestly wanting to know, what can we do? Straight folks are reaching out to queer friends or queer people on social media, wanting to know what they can do to help make this world a safer place. White people are asking Black folks, are starting to read books, wanting to know, like, how can we be better? You see men out there like, what, am I not allowed to ask girls on dates anymore? And we're like, no, that's not what we said. Like, okay, but as we begin to ask the question, how do we make amends? I think there are some important steps that you've likely already heard, but are worth repeating, that we need to be listening to the stories of people who have been oppressed and believe them. We need to lament. We need to grieve. We need to acknowledge the pain and the suffering, to say that it matters, that people matter. But today's scripture passages challenge us to dig a little bit deeper, and I'm excited to join you in thinking through practical ways that this posture might help us all love our neighbors a little bit better. What we see in this passage today, in this story today, is that the church is exploding. It's the book of Acts, right? It's gone from a small group of people who were friends of Jesus, who were like right there with him in the thick of things, to like tens of thousands of people. And we know from Acts 2 that they're trying to share all things in common and look out for both the spiritual and material needs of the people. So they had to have been kind of like flying by the seat of their pants, like trying to stay on top of this rapidly expanding community and naturally getting a lot of things wrong, because they're human beings and we tend to do that. At the same time, they've got people from all kinds of backgrounds joining the community. And as we all know, diversity creates opportunities for growth and creativity, but it also raises questions often about power. Who has it and how do they use it? And in this particular story, we see the Hellenistic Jews come to the apostles to let them know their widows are being overlooked in the distribution of food. So the apostles, or they're Hebraic Jews who were like the native Jewish population, And the Hellenistic Jews absorbed more of the Greek culture. There was some suspicion between the groups, as often happens, and the Hebraic Jews felt a little bit of a sense of superiority over the Hellenistic Jews, and everybody just kind of felt that. It was part of different communities coming together and trying to figure out, how do we do this? How do we be the church in this new moment? It's not unreasonable to imagine cultural tensions might have been at play behind the oversight of food distribution. So I imagine the Hellenists had to have been like, yo, it doesn't seem coincidental that you just happen to overlook our people while your widows are all looking like very well fed, right? So the Hebrews huddle, the apostles huddle, and they're like, okay, these guys are not wrong, and we need to rectify the situation. And the apostles decide they'll run the ministry, and they tell the Hellenistic Jews, the people with less power in this situation, to pick 7 people who will oversee the tables. Now, when I read that, I was like, okay, cool. The Hellenists will like pick 7 folks who are gonna like serve in the soup kitchen. Okay. Then I dug a little further into the text and my mind was completely blown. I learned that overseeing the tables is not simply about the distribution of food. It's about who oversees all of the finances. So this is not picking the people who will work the line in the weekly soup kitchen. This is the apostles saying, you oversee the budget. This is like next level reparations. Okay, so to recap, the people in this community with power chose to hand over their power and money to those with less power in order to make things right and move toward a more just and equitable community. Here's a list of things the apostles did not do. They did not say, okay, you pick 1 person to join our team of 7 decision makers so y'all can have a voice. They did not say, hey, we've let y'all join us. Community is hard. It's going to take time for us to work out all of the kinks. They did not say, whoa, why are y'all so angry? Have you thought about maybe making your case in a calmer manner and considering unity in this situation? No, they said, you know what? You're right. We messed this up. You guys should actually run things around here and we'll go focus on prayer and worship. I think this is an incredibly powerful model for those of us in progressive spaces, especially those of us in largely white progressive communities. Because we might be raising our voices more to show support for Black and brown or queer people, but I think we get tripped up when it comes to giving up or sharing our power. So I want to take a few minutes this morning to imagine how we might be able to identify areas where we have power and influence and use it in ways that move beyond statements and posters to lasting structural changes. Before we get into that, though, I want us to move from the theoretical to the real world of flesh and blood. Sometimes I think we can get into debating like theology or policy, and it's almost like it's for sport. But these aren't ideas we're talking about. And so if you're out there like, okay, intersectionality, I know, I want to remind you that this is not about being politically correct or woke. This is about human beings and how we can alleviate suffering for real people in the here and now. And to ground us in that, I want to read a quote from Ta-Nehisi Coates. It's a long quote, but it's incredibly powerful, so please stick with me. In his book, Between the World and Me, Ta-Nehisi Coates says this, the whole book is a letter to his son, and he says this, he says, I have raised you to respect every human being as singular, and you must extend that same respect into the past. Slavery is not an indefinable mass of flesh. It is a particular, specific, enslaved woman whose mind is as active as your own, whose range of feeling is as vast as your own, who prefers the way the light falls in one particular spot in the woods, who enjoys fishing where the water eddies in a nearby stream, who loves her mother in her own complicated way, thinks her sister talks too loud, has a favorite cousin, a favorite season, who excels at dressmaking and knows inside herself that she is as intelligent and capable as anyone. Slavery is this same woman born in a world that loudly proclaims its love of freedom and inscribes this love in its essential texts. A world in which these same professors hold this woman a slave, hold her mother a slave, her father a slave, her daughter a slave. And when this woman peers back into the generations, all she sees is the enslaved. She can hope for more. She can imagine some future for her grandchildren. But when she dies, the world, which is really the only world she can ever know, ends. For this woman, enslavement is not a parable. It is damnation. It is the never-ending night. And the length of that night is most of our history. Never forget that we were enslaved in this country longer than we have been free. Never forget that for 250 years, Black people were born into chains, whole generations followed by more generations who knew nothing but chains. That's why we're talking about how we can each play a part in creating more just and equitable systems. And that's why there's a sense of urgency, because entire human lives have already been lost while we've been trying to figure it out. If we take Jesus's call to love our neighbors seriously, we have to move past listening and learning and trying to figure it out. So I want to think this morning about a few ways that we might be able to do this practically, and I think it's going to look different for all of us. So my encouragement would be listen to some of these different examples and start thinking about where you might have power and influence, and what it might look like for you to creatively apply the sort of process we saw the apostles go through in your own life. A few examples of where I've seen this done well. Ken Fong, who I think you all might know at City Church, I think he's preached there before, was the lead pastor of a largely Asian American church called Evergreen Baptist Church in Los Angeles. And years ago, Ken started becoming friends with people in the LGBTQ community and inviting people to church and just saying like, hey, we want to be a safe place for you all. And so queer people started coming and bringing their friends, and there was like a sort of little queer group created that began to grow and expand. And as all these people started showing up, a lot of the straight folks in the congregation were like, like, what's our policy about LGBT people? Like, this is different. And so they start meeting and they go to Ken and they say, hey, Ken, we just noticed there's like lots of gays, and we were just kind of wondering, like, what's our policy about LGBTQ people? And Ken was like, we don't have one. And they were like, like, you know, we feel like we really need a policy to just kind of like lay out where the church is on the issue of sort of LGBTQ people. And he was like, okay, cool. I'll have the queer community write a policy for the church, you know, to sort of lay out what this looks like. And they were like, no, that's not what we meant. And Ken was just like, hey, like, we are not going to write a policy about this group of people. And so if we're going to have one, it's going to be them leading that charge, not the straight folks, you know, with power in this community. And I thought that was just a really profound answer to a question that just in his answer brought to light the importance of not just including a group of people in the process of deciding what inclusion looks like for them in the church, but like letting them run it and lead it and write the policies. I thought that was, I always thought that was so cool. Another example that I heard about in recent weeks, as we've seen, you know, a movement for Black lives happening all over the world, crying out for justice. I saw, or I heard somewhere about a co-founder of Reddit, who's a white dude, who gave up his board seat and told them to fill it with a Black person. And I think, like, gosh, if you want to talk about how to bring about the kinds of changes we so desperately need, those are the kinds of moves that are going to get us there. Because he wasn't like, you know, yeah, we should like get a Black person on our board, or maybe like a gay person. He was like, we need people like me. We need white dudes. We need people with my kind of power and influence our voices have been heard for a really, really long time now. We need people like me to be out of here to make space for underrepresented people to take over. Whew. That's kind of awesome. I think we see power structures beginning to change when parents, wealthier parents, often white parents, decide to send their kids to the local public school in their district rather than driving across town to go to a school with more resources. And, then those parents have a stake in the community. They're going to be showing up to the PTA meetings and neighborhood meetings and demanding accountability for how schools are funded and resourced. And we'll begin to see more equality in education in that way. I want to acknowledge that this can feel complicated and costly. As a writer and speaker, I think a lot about what that looks like for me in my role. So when I get a speaking request or I'm asked to write an op-ed, I think about whether my voice is the most important for that moment or if I should recommend someone else. And to be really honest, that can be kind of hard sometimes because I was excluded from so many systems for so long. And I know this really sucks, but I know there's only going to be a limited number of books about queer people, a limited number of queer speakers in a lineup. And I've heard things from publishers like, hey, we love your book idea, but we already published a book from a gay guy earlier this quarter. And it's like, oh, wow, well, okay, there's lots of us. Like, maybe you could publish too, And I just know there's going to be a limited number of queer people that are asked to write that op-ed about the latest gay news. And I think like, oh man, like, oh, I just got my foot in the door. Like, it can be kind of hard to think about, like, about sort of recommending someone else, passing those opportunities on. But I think about words like these from Audre Lorde, a queer Black woman who wrote this poem in 1973. As she wrote this about her experience of white feminism, of movements, largely white movements working for women's equality. Her poem is called Who Said It Was Simple? She says, there are so many roots to the tree of anger that sometimes the branches shatter before they bear. Sitting in netics, the women rally before they march, discussing the problematic girls they hire to make them free. An almost white counterman passes a waiting brother to serve them first, and the ladies neither notice nor reject the slighter pleasures of their slavery. But I, who am bound by my mirror as well as my bed, see causes and color as well as sex, and sit here wondering which me will survive all these liberations. I don't want to be a part of a movement or live in a world where anyone has to ask which part of them will survive these liberations. Because you know what the flip side of that statement means? It means some parts of them die. If we are serious about Jesus' call to love our neighbors, then each and every one of us needs to take an inventory of the areas where we hold power and have influence, and start to ask ourselves and our friends how we might be able to hold it a little more like the apostles did in our scripture passage today. Power over them for the way they had used that power. I cannot wait to see what happens. People begin to live in creative ways in your particular spaces. But I think it'll look a little more like the kingdom of heaven here on earth.